Thursday. Most companies destroy value. 70% of them sit below average. The real winners? Often companies you never heard to them. Today, we have been praising the wrong companies for 30 years. Hello, I'm Hugo Lourenço, and I'm here today with Steve Denning and Doug Kirkpatrick on our weekly podcast, Creating Value Wins. The fourth member of our team, Hunter Hastings, won't be here today since he was traveling. This is the third podcast in our series. In the first podcast, we had the world-famous Columbia Business School professor, Rick McGrath, explaining the massive changes underway in the workplace. And in the second podcast, we heard Harvard Business School professor Felix Oberholzer explaining the big picture about the business landscape. We are going to be answering your questions about this change and the way that most successful organizations are being run and how you can become part of this movement. And we are going to kick off by asking Steve Denning to join me. Hi, Steve.
Thanks, Hugo. And the fact is, Hugo and I and Doug and another of our partners, Hunter, have been puzzling over this big question really for the last 5 years together. And I've written 10 books about it. I've written more than 1,000 articles about it. But for much of that time, we felt that we were dealing with pieces of the puzzle, and we couldn't see how the puzzle fitted together in a holistic way. And what we have done in the last year is really, I think, been able to put the pieces together. We've been able to quantify, we've been able to document in a more systematic way than we've been ever able to do before. And when we did that, we were struck by 7 big surprises. What we found is that the world was not the way everyone said it was. It was actually very different. And we thought this discovery is something that needs to be shared with the world so that we can stop living in illusions. And we had 7 big surprises. And the first of the surprises is that some firms create a lot more value than others. We always knew that some firms created more value, but they create an enormous amount of value for others. And it's not just a little bit more value, it's a lot more value. As you can see in the chart that we'll see in just a second, the low-performing firms are bunched up on the left-hand end of the perspective. They are 70% of them are performing below average, whereas the 30% of the firms that are doing better, they are not just doing a little bit better, they are doing much, 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 much better. And so you have this very strange situation with a whole lot of low value creating firms and a smaller number of high value creation firms. And so it's a very unusual kind of picture. And what we see is that in the low value category, we find some of the most famous firms that people spend a lot of time talking about and discussing about. The stock price has gone up by $1 or down by $1. But in fact, those firms are performing so badly, we should be looking at why they are performing so badly. Whereas the firms that are doing outstandingly well include some well-known firms, obviously, like Apple and NVIDIA and Microsoft, but they also include, if you could put that chart back up again, they also include firms that you've probably never heard of, like ASML, which is a firm in Netherlands, and TSMC, which is a firm in Taiwan. So a lot of surprises, and we also found that some of the firms that are doing well are in sectors that we would never have expected. I mean, everyone talks about big tech and how they are making a fortune and getting rich beyond the dreams of avarice. But we also found that this is happening in pretty much every sector. We found that in firms like fashion or cosmetics or travel or you name it, you can find firms that are in this fast value creating mode. And it wasn't just big firms, it was also firms that are quite small. And they're not big now in capital terms, but they are growing very, very fast. And so if they continue on this track, and we're talking about the firms that have been doing this for 10 years, they are soon going to be some of the big firms and become famous firms. And one of the biggest surprises was the fact that these are not just firms in the US or even Europe. They are all around the world. You see this phenomenon of most firms are doing quite poorly, but a few firms are doing fantastically well. So you see this in the US and Europe, but you also see it in India, in China, Australia, Japan, Latin America. All the developed markets have this phenomenon going on. And so those 6 surprises were something quite remarkable. But the biggest surprise was the 7th surprise, and that is that these firms that are growing very fast, they all look very different on the surface. They are in different sectors, different sizes, different countries. But when you look at what's driving underneath them, is that they are firms that are very tightly focused on creating value for their customers. They are. This, we believe, is the simplest and most powerful idea in business today. Creating value wins. This whole podcast series is about helping individuals and firms understand this phenomenon that I've just described, the possible shift from low value creating firm to a high value creating firm, or be an individual who's creating a lot of value. And we know that we don't have all the answers. We've learned quite a lot in this 5 years, but we're still learning. And we're discussing with many other people who've also been working in the same field, like Rita McGrath and Felix last week. And together we are continuing to learn, continuing to innovate, continuing to understand what is this strange phenomenon that we're looking at with this very unusual distribution of the firms. And we don't treat value creation as just one thing of the firms that on a long list of things that a firm has to do, which is the traditional way management looks at this thing. This is the only thing on the list. This is the driving force of everything that happens in the organization. It becomes the culture of the organization. Some people call it that. Others call it's the ethos of the firm. Others call it's the whole purpose of the firm. So I have different labels for it, but what it is this abiding focus on creating value for customers. And not that they ignore value for themselves. It's a bit like the religious statement, love your neighbor as yourself. It's not that you ignore yourself, but you focus and have your whole being focused on creating value for customers. And the extraordinary thing is that when firms do this, which is kind of the opposite of the firms in traditional management, which were focused on making money, these firms that create value make much, much, much more firms that are focused on making money. So it's a paradox. It's ironical that by doing the opposite of what the firms do, you have a result. So it's not creating value by you don't win by focusing on making money. You actually win by creating value for your customers. In turn, if you do it right and do some of the other things we'll be talking about, you actually become a winning organization. And so everything in the firm needs to be focused on creating value. And we don't talk about management or leadership, which are terms that are about one group of people telling another group of people what to do. The managers or the leaders are telling other people what to do. This is about everyone in the organization being a value creator, everyone from the chief executive down to the most menial task. How is that person creating value for the organization? And we find, of course, that in many organizations, a lot of the things that are being done are not creating value for customers. They're being done because they've always been done or because they're taught in business schools, but they are not creating value. So this is about systematically eliminating those things that don't add value, as Felix was talking about last week, but also do more and more of the things that excite customers, that thrill them, that make them want to always do business with them. And so we want you to join us in this journey. Bring your questions, bring your ideas, bring your answers, and share them with us. The more we talk together about these issues, the greater the understanding we'll have about it and the more success we'll have. So let's go. Let's make it happen.
Thanks, Steve. The one that hits me hardest is surprise number 3. We have been praising the wrong companies. As a COO, I have watched leaders chase the playbooks of firms that are quietly failing. This sparks another question that we often get in one of the most important and the most basic. And we obviously talk about a lot about creating value. What exactly is value? Doug, would you like to explain to our audience what value, and I'd like to bring Doug here, what does it mean by value? That's a question that we have heard a lot.
Stage. A necessary starting point for creating value wins is to have a shared understanding of what value is. We're not referring to the idea of value as a small price for a large benefit, as in value for money. It's not just about getting a good economic deal. We're talking about value in the sense of value in experience. Value is the experience of an exchange in which the recipient, the customer, feels that their situation is improved for the better compared to their previous situation, relative to other choices they could have made. Economists talk about reaching a desired state that's better than the current state. In an economic exchange, that's the feeling, the emotion, the experience of value. In short, customers' lives become better. Value is a relational concept. It's experienced through human relationships. Understanding what matters most to customers is a relational act. Entering into an exchange is a relational act. Repeating that exchange is a relational act. These relations are positive. Promises kept, gratitude given, win-win situations. A good way to think of value is enablement. The customer is enabled to do what they couldn't do before, to achieve more, to better reach their desires and aspirations. That is value. Fundamental human demand never changes. It's all about food, clothing, shelter, communication, transportation, entertainment, personal security, and healthcare. When we increase customers' lives by creating experiences for which they're willing to pay, that's the ethos of value creation. It's ethical, it's fun, and it's profoundly human. We're seeing it today in the AI revolution. AI enables customers to achieve a lot more for a lot less, to do what they couldn't do before, whether those customers are businesses or individuals. That's why AI is valued so highly and why so many users are attracted to this technology. Everyone seeks the value of enablement. Customers are primary in this value formula. They're the ones seeking enablement. As Felix said in last week's podcast, a promise of future value generates willingness to pay more on their part. That's the key test of a value proposition. One person can create value for another. That's embodied in the religious saying, love your neighbor as yourself. It's an ethos, as Steve said before, starting with the personal, then the team, than the entire enterprise. In organizations, value can be created in many ways. You can create value by delivering value directly to your colleagues as internal customers. You enable them to do better work and to achieve their own goals, what Peter Drucker called a contribution mindset. That's value creation. You're part of a series of value-creating acts that ultimate reach is creating value for the end user. And every step in that series of value-creating acts is crucial. Value for customers can in turn create value for shareholders who have invested in the business and are looking for a return on that investment. They experience value when their expectations are met. So yes, shareholder value is part of the value formula, but it's an outcome at the end of the value cycle after customer value is harvested. If every firm delivers value for customers, the global economy would achieve greater value for all, improved standards of living, which is a term we use for the experience of value, with less waste, because waste is defined as a business effort that doesn't create value for customers. Bureaucracy, for example, a cost, not a value creation. Those firms that pursue value win on every front. They generate revenue through the customer's willingness to pay. They generate growth because they always find new value for customers through innovation. They generate high margins because customers are willing to pay more for increased value. They generate lasting relationships. They attract the best workers because creating value is fulfilling and can be very fun. And they attract investors who see future value creation. Value creation is a giant magnet for talent, customers, and investors.
That's right, Doug. And there's one other thing that we need to keep in mind, that it's not just creating more value, doing things that the customers love. It's stopping doing things that the customers hate, stopping doing things that annoy us every time we go to a particular shop or use a particular service or buy a particular product. Oh my God, there it is again. And within the firm, a lot of things are happening that are not adding value. That was never the purpose of the firm. So it's not surprising that you see those kind of things grow. But I mean, how big is that? Well, a book I love is David Graeber's Bullshit Jobs, who actually, he studied this and he determined 5 major categories of things that actually serve no purpose. And the person doing the job knows that it serves no purpose, but it keeps being done because that pays the salary and the firm keeps grinding along. That's the way they've always done things. This is about taking a hard look at those bullshit jobs and eliminating them and stop annoying customers with things that do not add value. The whole movement is about working on both ends of adding more value at the top, but also taking away at the bottom. This is what the whole value creation movement is about.
The value creation movement is about eliminating all value destruction and maximizing maximizing the value creation. So why not treat people as people? We had a question before from Andrew Sharman. What would happen if we flip the script from human resources to resourceful humans and treated people that way? And Edward Alb phrased it, what if we follow the great philosopher Immanuel Kant, who treated humanity as an end itself, not merely a means to an end? Steve, would you like to give that shot?
Absolutely. And thanks to Andrew and Edward, who asked the question. The movement shift from management to value creation is indeed flipping the script. And it's sometimes talked about something that might happen, something that should happen. But sadly, it's not happening because people are focusing on the bottom 70%, which are certainly not trying to create value and not actually achieving value. But this is about focusing on the high-performing top 30%, and we are finding that this is already happening. We don't have to wait to find out how it's done. If we open our eyes, we already see that these firms are doing it. And as I mentioned, they're in different sectors. They have different labels. They use, to some extent, different language. But it's a radically different activity from the way companies were run in the 20th century. 70% of firms still being run in that way. But the 30% have made the shift from viewing people as resources, human resources, things where you tell people what to do and how to do it, and they have to follow the instructions. This instead is empowering and enabling resourceful humans so that they can see themselves how they can not only deliver the value that they have been delivering, but new ways, innovating to create more value and using the interaction with customers, if they're on the front lines, to find ways in which they can spontaneously find new ways to add value to the customer, adjusting what the firm does to make the whole experience better. And each of the high-flying firms that we'll be talking about in this series do in different ways. They also, because they're cleaning up some of the baggage, in a sense, removing things that don't add value, they also are, in some occasions, removing staff because they are not adding value, and keeping them on the staff, even though they're not adding value, is not helping anyone. And when that happens, of course, you have articles, big articles in the New York Times saying, "Oh, look at this terrible thing. This big firm just fired a whole number of people. That's horrible. That's they have rich people in the firms. Why don't they just keep on these firms that they don't need, these people that they don't need, and keep doing it?" And no, the firm is saying, "Look, we have to not only love our neighbor, but we need to love ourselves. We need to stop doing things that are not adding value." And we are not saying that everything that these firms do is right. They obviously make mistakes, and sometimes they make huge mistakes. But on the whole, these firms in the top 30% are doing most of the things right. And it's not all as random in that it's not always the same in the firm, that firms are doing things differently. And what we'll be talking about in this whole podcast is learning the different ways that firms have done it and it succeeded in creating value, and learning how you can, in your firm, in your workspace, how you can, in fact, create more and more value. We're teaching you, showing you how to make it happen.
So, Steve, one thing to add. I served in the Portuguese Marines, training, command and control, and I can tell you the best officers I had didn't issue orders. They set the context and trusted us to figure it out. So Kent was right, even in the most hierarchical institutions there is. We have a question also from our audience who says, you talked about that management without managers. But isn't an impossible dream? We keep hearing about Morningstar, but why aren't there any other examples? Doug, perhaps you want to follow this one?
Sure. Thanks, Hugo. I love this question. As a member of the startup core team at Morningstar, I appreciate the question. And yet I would challenge the premise of the question just a little bit. We have examples like Semco, where Ricardo Semler took over his company in 1980 and really flattened it, got rid of hierarchy, and created lots of employee autonomy, and self-direction, had open information, distributed decision-making, far fewer rules and bureaucracy than most firms, and improved culture and trust. So Morningstar is not the only example. It has been an example for some 35 years. The founder, Chris Ruffer, is a very visionary leader, and yet he doesn't consider himself a CEO. He considers himself a founder and a leader, and has grounded his firm on core principles that have enabled radical self-management for many years. This firm became famous by being on the cover of the Harvard Business Review in 2011. But we have lots of examples in the world of exemplars that can directionally point the way toward massive value creation. Let's consider NVIDIA. NVIDIA is not a fully self-managed company in a radical democratic sense in terms of Semco of Morningstar, but it does feel a flat organizational structure with significant autonomy for high-performing, self-starting individuals. And it does have intense, concentrated leadership from its CEO, Jensen Huang. So it's largely self-management in various aspects, an extremely flat hierarchy. Jensen Huang has 40 to 60 direct reports, which is very unusual for a massive company, minimizing management layers, keeping the organization dynamic and agile. It has what they call organized chaos, minimal bureaucracy, minimal restrictions, real responsibility, freedom to cross boundaries, freedom to solve problems without heavy oversight. Well, teams and individuals decide how to approach their work, so they have distributed decision rights. Reporting lines are in existence, but are secondary to getting projects done. Information flows freely throughout the enterprise, transparently, a one-team mentality throughout the organization. Very few one-to-one meetings. Feedback is delivered openly so that it's shared and creates shared understanding among leaders. And NVIDIA focuses on hiring self-directed individuals who can manage themselves. What's the result? Well, the market value of NVIDIA is approaching $5 trillion. And this is in the range of the entire gross domestic product of Canada. This organization is an exemplar in teaching us how to create value for customers and for the world at large. Many examples exist.
So let me add to that as well. I worked on transformation at Chevron, Roche, Siemens, and in every of them, even others, change wasn't allowed at the beginning. What worked, it was finding one team, one project that most people don't even care, let's be honest, but where we could prove the principle quietly. We don't ask permission, we make the principle visible by getting results with coherence, with consistency, by principles and values. So once one team works differently, but outperforms with good cadence, with responsibility, the rest of the organization comes and asks, how can we do that? Of course, before people try to stop us and demoting us to achieve whatever, and minimizing the efforts of delivering value. But that consistency, that perseverance changed everything. So what do you tell people who say this whole value creation thing is unrealistic? You can't flip the script and treat people as people because a business is a highly competitive activity. A business has to make money to survive. If you forget that, you go to bankrupt in no time. Steve, I'm sure you have a strong opinion on this. Your thoughts?
I do, Hugo. And I used to think like that. I remember I did a workshop for Netflix back in 2004. And we had a great workshop, and it was very exciting. And then I asked them, what was the policy? What were the human resource policies that you have in your firm? And the answer was, we don't have any. We don't have any. People go on vacation when they like. They do what they think will add value, and we trust them. And we obviously monitor the results. And if people are not creating value, we suggest they might want to work elsewhere. But there are no rules, no rules. And I thought, this is crazy. This is never going to work. And in fact, I was quite skeptical about whether Netflix would survive with those kind of practices or whether this was applicable elsewhere. But over the last 20 years, I found out that Reed Hastings was right and I was wrong. That at the time, they were just emerging as a startup. I mean, they were a tiny startup and they were facing a big company like Blockbuster. And Reed actually was annoyed because he had to go to the shop to rent DVDs to see videos. And he thought there must be a better way. And so he started doing them by mail and then eventually doing them online. And then eventually it's become a massive, massive corporation, trillion-dollar corporation, and created massive value, all using these very different ways of running the company, relying very much on the initiative of individuals, encouraging, enabling individuals, and setting aside anyone who's not adding value. And so we've talked also about Google back in 2007 with exactly the same thing. They were explaining that to the Gary Hamel and the Moonshots for Management group. And the business school professors looked at what Eric Schmidt was describing, and they said that will never work. Exactly what I said, but they were wrong. And Google is now a $4 trillion company. So this can work. We need to open our eyes. We need to look at these firms that are actually doing much, much better than other firms and seeing how they work and realizing that things that, if we follow what we're taught in business school, shouldn't work, won't work, can't work, actually are doing wonders. So we need to open our eyes and see what's actually going on in the world. That's the bottom line. This looks unrealistic, but in fact, it's extremely realistic.
Many readers have told us that value creation is mission impossible. Resistance to change is strong. Business schools persist in teaching what they always taught. Margaret Whitley became famous for applying science to show that all big hierarchies were doomed, would collapse, and would be due to find a safe place with other skeptics and the wait for the new regime. What is the most important skill to make the change? What is our advice, Doug?
Thank you, Hugo, for a great question. For this question, I would turn to my dear friend, the late Dr. Peter Kestenbaum, who wrote a very important article, or rather was interviewed for a very important article in Fast Company magazine in the early 2000s. The title of the article was, "Do You Have the Will to Lead?" And in it, he emphasizes the importance of free will. We all have free will. We know this because the three of us have chosen to be on this podcast this morning, and we chose to be here when we could have chosen to be someplace else. And everyone listening to this podcast has chosen to do so freely, and they could have chosen to do something else. We all have free will, and the job of every leader is to exercise that free will and to make a choice. And they can choose to create organizations that create value and focus on value creation, or they can choose to do otherwise and focus on profits in the short term and their promotion and their salaries and whatever else they choose. So we need leaders to understand the crucial importance of value creation and choose to pursue it for the benefit of all.
What do you think, Steve?
Having the will to make change and to improve things, I think, is absolutely crucial. I agree with Doug. But there's something else that I think is almost maybe as important or even more important, and that is being able to communicate effectively the change that you want. I worked in the World Bank for 3 decades, and the first 2.5 decades, I was trying to affect change by explaining to people what needed to be done and giving them rational reasons why they should do things differently. And it was finding consistently that every thing I said was driving them deeper into opposition to what I was proposing, because they knew I was wrong and they were right. And telling them that they were wrong just made things worse, actually. Until one day, by accident, I stumbled on the power of a story. When I stumbled on that story, I was proposing a major change, but it was a very simple story. And what I found was that enabled people who had been resistant in the past suddenly saw how it would be possible, how their lives would be better, because they envisioned themselves in this simple story. And lo and behold, a whole movement began and eventually changed the whole strategy of the World Bank. So storytelling, leadership storytelling is up there with will to change, a crucial skill if you're trying to make change in a big hierarchical organization heading in a different direction.
Okay, so if you just join us so far, or if you just join us here on LinkedIn, 4 rules that you have here and you've been listening to us since the start of this podcast. First, create value wins. Believe in yourself. Don't waste your time and money in non-added value activities. Respect yourself as well. You respect others. Do you want for your economic freedom? If this is something you also pursue, it's basically simple. Create value in what you do, even if it's just for yourself. So in saying this, I work in a firm that sometimes people ask that they won't allow any of the talk of change. And what should I do? So a lot of people tell us this, they work in these kind of firms. They are not able to talk about the change because they already had so many changes that nobody tolerant. Their tolerance for change is it's very rarely right now impossible to hear that word again. So things like that, or other names that people keep preaching in a way that doesn't help anyone. So Steve, what do you think on companies where people are not able to talk on change anymore because of so many failures of that change that brought in perhaps even any improvement?
Well, I think you need to work with what you've got. Start with by asking and finding like-minded people, anyone else in your organization who might be thinking in the same way. Start meeting with those people as a group and find out why you think differently from the rest of the organization. Find out what you have in common and spread the word. What we found in the World Bank was that there were people at the very top of the organization who were in sync with what we were saying, but they too were stifled. So an alliance with those kinds of people will create a possibility when there's a crack in the wall of resistance by the management of the organization, a crisis emerges, and suddenly they say, what are we going to do in this terrible crisis? And then you may have a union of a hidden alliance in the background that can emerge from the shadows and say, look, there's a way out of this. Let me tell you what it is. And bingo, suddenly you're off to the races. So don't give up. And if you find that it's totally impossible to make change in the organization, there's always a chance to go somewhere else. You are not bound to stay with that organization for your whole life and live in misery. Find an organization that is creating value and get a real life.
And sometimes there is also huge advantages doing that. You move to another company, you learn other things, and perhaps soon they would say, well, that person, that can help us a lot, and you might back with much better conditions and much more empowered to do whatever change that needs to happen. Doug, what do you think on this? What about the employees?
Well, my mind ran to examples of organizations which were not life affirming, which were probably brutal in their culture and approach to people. I think of Sunbeam under the leadership of Chainsaw Al Dunlap. I can't imagine that was very fun or enriching for human beings. I think the ultimate goal of every human being should be to connect with their personal source of authentic meaning. I think every individual has an ethical obligation to themselves and the people they care about, including their colleagues, to find ways to create value and make life better. At work, this can include expanding one's sphere of influence. That could incorporate all the tactics that Steve just mentioned. One can propose experiments, seek out new projects, expand their sphere of influence by connecting with other teams and other business units and functions. New projects. If one finds oneself in a brutal or ruthless culture, then you probably have an ethical obligation to at least plan your exit, even if an exit is not immediately possible. So connecting with authentic meaning is crucial. That's my thought.
Thank you, Doug. So some people question the emphasis that we put on shareholder returns and making money. And Steve, you talk a lot about that, about Standard & Poor's 500 and the financial data. So, and what about the staff?
The employees are obviously a crucial part of the organization, and if they're not getting value, they are not going to do a good job, and you're going to have a very disengaged staffing. And because these firms make so much money, they are in the public spotlight, and when they do things, they get a lot of attention. And so you had a recent article in the New York Times about a firm with more than 500,000 employees, and the article was an article about five employees who had a very unfortunate experience and felt that they'd been badly treated by the organization. So, and the experience of these five employees out of 500,000 was being blown up into a huge, huge scandal for the whole organization. And of course, it was just a tiny blip that may have been, they may have done wrong in those 5 cases, but in any organization with 500,000 people. You're going to have some people who are. So you need to look at the big picture. So what is happening overall, and what we see when we look at the data carefully, looking at all of the complaints in the various websites that, like Glass House, that collect what staff feel. The studies show that, in fact, the firms that are creating more value for the firm and for the shareholders and for the customers, they also create more value for the customers, 13% above average. So the idea that these firms are all treating all their customers badly is obviously a myth. And we need to look at the perspective at the same time as when there are wrong things happening, they should be criticized, they should be pointed out. And so we're not saying that any of these firms is perfect, but they are doing better than average in the way that employees view them and the way the workplace evolves.
So the value creation principles that we articulated in Lisbon in September last year, they articulate what was consistently worked better in business and what was not. They are drawn from rigorous research done by major institutions, based on studies of thousands of major companies around the world. The value creation principles constitute a way of running businesses that embodies a mindset, goals, values, operations, processes, and metrics that align to deliver steadily, increasingly differentiating value to customers and all other stakeholders. Compared to traditional management, the value creation principles are not just about doing business differently. They are about being a different kind of business. The principles aren't fluffy manifestos or idealistic dreams. The principles are actionable best practice, distilled from multiple comprehensive studies. In short, firms do better when they prioritize customer delight over short-term profits, build autonomous networks over rigid hierarchies, and embrace adaptive mindsets over mechanistic processes. The principles are interactive and multiplicative. While old-school tactics still proliferate, research by many institutions shows that principles generally deliver better workplaces, happy customers, and superior long-term profits. Paradoxically, right? But not fixating on profits. Firms ignoring this, they are management equivalent of the bloodletting and unwittingly caused needless harm to billions through the ages. So this year, by September, we are also going to have, and we had a question from Kathleen Curran that I thank you so much, asking about what we're going to do this year in September. So our September conference is going to be online and is for those that are actively running value creation and for those that aim to do better in their organizations. Not a typical management conference. No consultants selling frameworks. It will be by example from executives who are running or run organizations only around value. We are going to split in two momentums. And for 3 hours on each day, plus some additional activities, you'll be able to influence others to create values as well. And if someone asks you why attending this event, one thing to take into your next day after the event, and even today after our podcast, before your next decision, ask whose life gets better because of value creation principles being applied. If you can't name them, well, let's face it, you're not creating value. You're moving paper. So try to find the answer and then decide. I'm almost sure your participation is crucial. Also coming up next week for our fourth podcast, Johan Ross, talking about the human magic involved in getting value from AI. And also don't forget to register for our next podcast and the online conference in September 22nd, 23rd. So I would like also to thank you to Chris Valle and Capaldi that online are giving some comments and supporting basically not just the podcast, but also the movement. Thank you so much to them. And of course, want to thank you to Steve and Doug for being here with us today. So I hope you'll be with us next week for another podcast with Johan Roos. Don't forget that. And thanks for being here today. Thank you so much.